Some men build a system of terror, others operate it, and some are eventually destroyed by the very machinery they helped create. Mikhail Petrovich Frinovsky belonged to the third category. He was not Stalin, he was not the head of the Soviet government, and he was not an executioner in the literal sense of the word. But Frinovsky was one of the senior officials who transformed Stalin's political orders into arrests, interrogations, deportations, and executions. As Nikolai Yezhov's deputy, he stood at the operational center of the NKVD during the Great Terror. He helped supervise the largest mass operations of the Soviet secret police, including the campaign against so-called anti-Soviet elements and the persecution of Soviet citizens of Polish origin. He also helped organize the machinery that would later destroy him. This is the story of Mikhail Frinovsky, Yezhov's deputy and one of the organizers of the Great Terror. Mikhail Petrovich Frinovsky was born in 1898. When the First World War began, the Russian Empire mobilized millions of men. In 1916, Frinovsky was called into the Imperial Russian Army. His military service took place during the final years of the old regime, a period marked by military defeats, shortages, political unrest, and the collapse of state authority. In 1917, the February Revolution overthrew the monarchy. Several months later, the Bolsheviks seized power in Petrograd. The revolution was followed by civil war. The new Soviet government faced white armies, foreign intervention, nationalist movements, armed uprisings, and political opposition. The Bolsheviks responded by creating and expanding the Cheka, the Extraordinary Commission for Combating Counter-Revolution and Sabotage. The Cheka was not an ordinary police force. It was an instrument of revolutionary violence. Its officers were expected to identify enemies, uncover conspiracies, and eliminate opposition. Arrest, imprisonment, and execution became political tools of the new state. Frinovsky moved into the Bolshevik security apparatus during this period. Sources place his service in the Cheka from 1919 onward. He gained experience in military security operations and in the suppression of armed resistance. His early career was built in a political environment where violence was not an exception to the system. It was one of the system's foundations. For men like Frinovsky, the Civil War was also a school. It taught them how to identify enemies, how to conduct operations, and how to obey orders without asking where those orders would ultimately lead. After the Civil War, the Soviet security organs did not disappear. The Cheka was reorganized into the GPU and later into the OGPU. The names changed, but the political function remained. The security service monitored opposition, investigated alleged conspiracies, and protected the growing dictatorship of the Communist Party. During the 1920s, Stalin gradually defeated his political rivals. The left opposition was pushed aside. Trotsky was expelled from the Soviet Union. Later, former allies of Stalin were accused of belonging to the right opposition. The security organs were essential to this process. Political disagreement could be reinterpreted as treason. A former political connection could become evidence of conspiracy. An old friendship could be presented as proof of anti-Soviet activity. Frinovsky continued to rise inside the system. He was not a major political theorist. He was a security official, an organizer and commander. His value lay in his ability to turn decisions from above into action below. By the beginning of the 1930s, he had become an experienced officer in the Soviet security structure. He had learned how the system worked. First came suspicion, then surveillance, then arrest, then interrogation, and finally, a confession that confirmed the original accusation. The system did not always begin by asking what a person had done. It often began by deciding what kind of enemy that person supposedly was. In September 1936, Nikolai Yezhov replaced Genrikh Yagoda as head of the NKVD. Yagoda had already overseen major crimes, including forced labor and political repression. But Stalin increasingly viewed him as insufficiently reliable. Yezhov was different. He was a party official who owed his rapid rise to Stalin. He had less of an independent base inside the security organs and appeared to be a more dependable instrument of the Soviet leadership. But Yezhov needed experienced officers to run the NKVD. One of them was Mikhail Frinovsky. Frinovsky became Yezhov's deputy and one of the most important operational figures in the secret police. His task was not simply to sit in an office and sign documents. He helped coordinate the relationship between the NKVD leadership in Moscow and the regional security administrations that carried out arrests throughout the Soviet Union. The Great Terror required an enormous chain of command. It involved central directives, regional quotas, local arrest lists, interrogation teams, special tribunals, prison officials, and execution squads. Frinovsky stood near the center of that chain. He was one of the men who translated political decisions into administrative procedures. The Great Terror reached a new level in the summer of 1937. On July 30th, Nikolai Yezhov signed NKVD Order No. 00447, concerning the repression of former kulaks, criminals, and other alleged anti-Soviet elements. The order divided targets into two categories. Those placed in the first category were to be executed. Those in the second category were to be sent to labor camps or prison facilities. The process was conducted largely outside the normal judicial system. Special bodies known as troikas could sentence people rapidly and in secret. But Frinovsky was not merely a passive administrator of this operation. The order itself assigned him overall leadership of the conduct of the operations. It also ordered the creation of a special group under his supervision to manage the campaign. This is one of the most important documents for understanding his responsibility. Frinovsky did not create Order No. 00447 alone. The order was issued by Yezhov and approved at the highest level of the Soviet leadership. But the text placed Frinovsky directly in charge of its execution. He was therefore not simply one of many officials implementing the terror. He was the senior operational officer designated to supervise the process. The order established targets, categories, and procedures. Regional NKVD officials were expected to identify people who supposedly threatened the Soviet state. The scale of repression quickly expanded. Officials were placed under pressure to demonstrate vigilance. A low number of arrests could suggest that local authorities were failing to uncover enemies. Requests for additional quotas were often sent to Moscow and approved. Terror became a bureaucratic process. A name appeared on a list. The list became an arrest. The arrest produced an interrogation. The interrogation produced another name. And the cycle continued. Officials could demonstrate their loyalty by producing large numbers of arrests and executions. What looked like administrative efficiency was in reality organized mass violence. Among the most important national operations of the NKVD was the campaign against people connected, or allegedly connected, with Poland. On August 11, 1937, Nikolai Yezhov signed Order No. 00485. The order launched the so-called Polish operation. The NKVD claimed that Polish intelligence had created networks of spies and saboteurs inside the Soviet Union. The accusations were broad. They could be directed against Polish political émigrés, former members of Polish organizations, people accused of belonging to the Polish military organization, defectors, prisoners of war, and Soviet citizens suspected of having connections with Poland. In practice, nationality, family background, or a previous association could be enough to attract suspicion. The order also placed Frinovsky directly inside the operation. It stated that lists of agents selected for recruitment were to be submitted to Frinovsky for approval. This does not mean that every arrest list was personally signed by him, but it does show that he occupied a direct supervisory position within the operation. The campaign began in August 1937 and continued for more than a year. People were arrested in cities, villages, factories, offices, and military units. Many were accused of espionage without credible evidence. Confessions were frequently extracted during interrogation. Cases were processed through extraordinary procedures rather than ordinary public trials. According to Soviet archival statistics commonly cited by historians, approximately 139,815 people were arrested or processed during the operation, and 111,071 were sentenced to death. Behind these numbers were families: a father taken from his home after midnight, a wife waiting for a letter that never arrived, children growing up with the official explanation that a parent had been an enemy of the people. The Polish operation did not target only imaginary spies. It destroyed real communities and left a deep mark on the history of Poles in the Soviet Union. Frinovsky was not the only official responsible for this campaign. The order was signed by Yezhov, and the operation required the participation of the entire NKVD structure. But Frinovsky was one of the senior figures positioned inside the operational chain that made the repression possible. The NKVD was used against Soviet society, but it also became a battlefield within the Soviet leadership. The security organs constantly searched for hidden enemies. At the same time, their own commanders were exposed to arrest. A successful official accumulated power and knowledge. That could make him useful. It could also make him dangerous. Frinovsky knew how the operations were organized. He knew which orders had been issued and which officials had carried them out. He knew how confessions were produced and how regional reports were prepared. In a dictatorship, knowledge can become a liability. The NKVD repeatedly purged its own officers. Regional chiefs were accused of belonging to conspiracies. Investigators became defendants. Men who had spent years arresting others were themselves placed in handcuffs. The official explanation was that traitors had infiltrated the security organs. But the political reality was more complicated. Stalin needed to control the people who controlled the state's instruments of coercion. The security service could never be allowed to become an independent center of power. Frinovsky was therefore both valuable and vulnerable. He had helped direct the machinery of repression. He also knew too much about how that machinery operated. One of the most controversial episodes associated with Frinovsky concerns Abram Slutsky, the head of the NKVD's Foreign Intelligence Service. Slutsky died in February 1938. The official explanation was that he suffered a heart attack in Frinovsky's office. After his own arrest, however, Frinovsky claimed that Yezhov had ordered Slutsky's removal. According to Frinovsky's later testimony, Slutsky was invited to the office, where Ivan Zakhovsky used chloroform and another officer, Sergei Alekin, administered poison. This account has been discussed by later Russian intelligence sources, but those sources also question it and point to Slutsky's heart condition as a possible natural explanation. The safest conclusion is therefore a cautious one. Frinovsky later claimed that Slutsky had been murdered on Yezhov's orders, but the precise circumstances of Slutsky's death remain disputed. The episode nevertheless illustrates the world in which Frinovsky operated. In the NK5D, death could be disguised as illness. An official explanation could be manufactured within hours, and a senior officer could disappear without any public investigation. Whether Slutsky died naturally or was murdered, the story reflects the secrecy and paranoia of Stalin's security apparatus. By 1938, the NKVD had become deeply associated with mass repression. Yezhov stood at the center of the terror. Frinovsky was one of his principal deputies. But the political climate began to change. Stalin's leadership now faced a problem. The terror had destroyed large numbers of supposed enemies, but the security organs themselves had become powerful, chaotic, and difficult to control. A new phase required new personnel. On September 8, 1938, Frinovsky was removed from the NKVD and appointed People's Commissar of the Navy. He held the position until April 6, 1939. On paper, this looked like a promotion. In reality, it was probably a way of moving him away from the center of the security apparatus. The timing was significant. Frinovsky had not suddenly become a naval expert. His appointment was not the normal result of a long naval career. He was being transferred from the organization that had made him powerful. The man who had helped supervise mass operations was now placed in charge of the Soviet Navy. But this new position did not protect him. It may even have made his situation worse. He had lost the institutional base that had shielded him. He was no longer at the center of the NKVD, while the incoming leadership had every reason to remove the men associated with Yezhov's administration. In November 1938, Yezhov himself was removed as head of the NKVD. Lavrenti Beria became his successor. The old leadership of the security organs was now exposed. On April 6, 1939, Mikhail Frinovsky was arrested. The accusations followed the familiar pattern of Stalinist political cases. He was charged with participating in an anti-Soviet conspiracy, abusing his position, and carrying out illegal activities inside the NKVD. These charges contained a bitter irony. Frinovsky had genuinely participated in mass repression. But the Soviet state was not interested in conducting an honest investigation into the Great Terror. It needed a new explanation. According to this explanation, the abuses had been committed by traitors inside the security organs. The leadership could present itself as the force restoring legality, even though the same political system had created the conditions for mass repression. Frinovsky was interrogated for months. The surviving interrogation materials and statements show him responding to accusations of conspiracy and illegal activity while facing the same kind of investigative machinery that the NKVD had used against thousands of prisoners. The purpose was not to establish the truth through an independent process. The purpose was to produce a case. A confession was valuable because it confirmed the official narrative. The accused could be guilty of real crimes, fabricated crimes, or both. In Stalin's system, the distinction often had little practical importance. Frinovsky's case was handled by the Military Collegium of the Soviet Supreme Court. The proceedings were conducted behind closed doors and offered no meaningful opportunity to contest the charges. He was sentenced to death. The exact date of his execution is disputed in the available sources. Some biographies give February 4th, 1940. Archival and memorial-related records cite February 8, 1940. For that reason, it is safer to say that Frinovsky was sentenced to death and executed in Moscow in February 1940, rather than present one date as certain. The uncertainty is not a minor detail. It reflects the broader problem of reconstructing the history of Stalinist repression. Records were classified, altered, or destroyed. Official accounts were often incomplete. Later sources sometimes repeated dates without explaining their origin. What is not disputed is the outcome. Frinovsky was executed. The system he had served had now eliminated him, but his death did not mean that political repression had ended. The personnel changed. The methods were adapted. The NKVD continued to serve as an instrument of dictatorship under Beria. Frinovsky was sacrificed not because the Soviet state had rejected terror, but because the terror was being reorganized under new management. Frinovsky's life reveals several important features of Stalinist repression. First, the terror was not carried out by one man. Stalin provided the political direction. Yezhov headed the NKVD during the most intense phase, but senior deputies, regional chiefs, investigators and local officials turned orders into arrests and executions. Frinovsky was one of the most important officials in that structure. Second, terror depended on bureaucracy. The machinery operated through orders, quotas, reports, lists, signatures, and approvals. Administrative language concealed human suffering. People were transformed into categories, elements, cases, and targets. Third, Frinovsky's career shows how quickly Stalinist servants could become disposable. Loyalty offered protection only while a person remained politically useful. A man could spend years serving the regime and then be arrested as soon as the leadership required a new scapegoat. Fourth, the story reveals how authoritarian systems transfer blame. After 1938, the Soviet leadership condemned violations of socialist legality. But it did not question the political structure that had made mass repression possible. Some perpetrators were punished. The system that produced them survived. Mikhail Frinovsky was not the architect of Stalinist terror at the level of Stalin himself. Nor was he the chief executioner in the literal sense. He was something more specific, and historically more important. He was a senior organizer who helped convert political orders into practical repression. He helped supervise Order No. 00447. He was directly involved in the operational chain of the Polish operation. He stood close to Yezhov during the most violent period of the Great Terror. Then, when the political wind changed, he was removed from the NKVD and given a strange new position as head of the Soviet Navy. The promotion did not save him. He was arrested on April 6, 1939, sentenced to death and executed in Moscow in February 1940. He helped build the machine. He helped direct it, and when the machine changed direction, it destroyed him. Frinovsky's story was not an exception. It was one of the central rules of Stalin's system. The people who carried out repression could never be certain that they would remain outside its reach. Mikhail Frinovsky was not the master of the Great Terror, but he was one of the men who made it possible.